Henry Brogan, one of the most elite snipers ever employed by the government, is stationed deep in the countryside of Belgium, lying low among the tall grass while carefully preparing for another impossible assignment. Through his scope, he tracks a man named Valery Dormov, who is comfortably riding aboard a speeding train. Every movement is calculated with absolute precision. Feeding him updates from inside the operation is fellow DIA operative Marino, who keeps Henry informed about the train's speed, positioning, and the target's exact location. Henry steadies himself and lines up the shot perfectly, but just as he's about to pull the trigger, a young woman unexpectedly walks over to Dormov. The sudden interruption forces him to hold back for a split second because one mistake could kill an innocent person instead. The moment she moves away and the line clears, Henry finally fires. The bullet tears across the massive distance and strikes Dormov in the neck only moments before the train disappears into a tunnel. After the mission is completed, Marino excitedly praises the unbelievable shot, amazed that Henry managed to hit the target with such impossible timing and accuracy. He even records the aftermath on his phone out of admiration, though Henry immediately orders him to erase the footage. For Henry, there's nothing glamorous about the kill. Instead of satisfaction, he feels exhausted and disturbed. Years of taking lives have begun weighing heavily on him, and the guilt is becoming impossible to ignore. Haunted by his work every night before sleep, he decides he's finally done with the job. Not long afterward, he meets with Del Patterson and opens up about his decision to retire. Henry admits that the mission in Belgium shook him badly because a single mistake could have taken the innocent girl's life along with the target. He says he wants peace for once, a chance to stop living with blood on his conscience. Trying to disappear quietly, Henry rents a boat and spends time near the harbor, where he crosses paths with a woman named Danny. She presents herself as a harmless administrator, though Henry immediately senses there's more to her than she lets on. Using the boat, he later meets with his old friend Jack, who reveals a shocking truth. Valery Dormov was never actually a terrorist. According to Jack, Dormov was a molecular biologist, and the intelligence Henry received had been deliberately manipulated. Furious after learning he may have assassinated an innocent man, Henry demands to meet Yuri, Jack's source, so he can uncover who falsified the information. What Henry doesn't realize is that the entire meeting is secretly being monitored. DIA Director Janet Lassiter and Gemini founder Cliv are listening to every word through surveillance equipment planted nearby. The moment they realize Henry is beginning to uncover classified secrets, they immediately see him as a liability. Clay convinces Lassiter that Henry must be eliminated before he becomes a threat to them both. Back at the dock, Henry notices something suspicious aboard the boat and discovers a wire connected to hidden surveillance equipment. Instantly suspicious, he confronts Danny and accuses her of spying for the DIA. Danny remains calm under pressure and smoothly answers every question he throws at her, never breaking composure. Realizing he may have judged her too quickly, Henry apologizes for the accusation and awkwardly invites her to dinner as a way to make up for it. During their evening together, Henry eventually uncovers the truth anyway. Danny finally admits that she really is connected to the DIA, though her reaction makes it clear she isn't directly involved in whatever operation is unfolding around him. After dinner, they part ways, with Danny quietly suggesting they may never see each other again. That same night, everything spirals out of control. Armed men sent by Lassiter storm Jack's boat and brutally murder both Jack and his girlfriend. At nearly the same time, Henry suddenly wakes from sleep after sensing someone inside his home. His instincts immediately kick in. Realizing multiple attacks are happening simultaneously, he calls Marino and desperately warns him to get out of his house immediately. But over the phone, Henry hears the horrifying sounds of Marino being killed before he can escape. Knowing he's next, Henry quickly arms himself and heads straight for Danny. He's convinced now that she wasn't part of the assassination plot, which means she's likely become a target too. Meanwhile, Danny arrives at the harbor searching for transportation when a mercenary attacks her. The assassin underestimates her completely. Danny fights back fiercely and manages to overpower the attacker, extracting information about who sent him before escaping. A short time later, Henry reaches the harbor and reunites with her. Danny reveals that the killers were sent directly by Lassiter. With enemies closing in from every direction, the two steal a boat and flee together before more mercenaries arrive. By the following day, Henry is still struggling to understand why everyone suddenly wants him dead. While waiting for extraction from his old friend Baron, he tries piecing together the conspiracy surrounding Dormov's death. Elsewhere, Clay Varys grows frustrated with the repeated failures of Lassiter's agents. Deciding the DIA is incompetent, he announces that Gemini will personally take over the hunt for Henry. Henry contacts Dell again, demanding answers. Dell reluctantly admits that both Gemini and Lassiter are behind the attacks, but he's powerless to stop them because the orders come from higher up. He also reveals that Dormov once worked for Gemini as a researcher, meaning Henry's assassination of him forced Clay into damage control mode. Danny explains further that Gemini is a private paramilitary organization run by Clay Verris himself, specializing in covert kidnappings, torture, and black operations. Clay, it turns out, used to be Henry's superior years ago and once tried recruiting both Henry and Baron into Gemini, though they refused the offer. The group temporarily escapes to Colombia, hoping to disappear long enough to regroup. During their stay, Henry reflects on his complicated history with Clay and the dangerous obsession the man always had with creating perfect soldiers. The next morning, Henry wakes early and notices movement across a nearby rooftop. Another sniper has positioned himself nearby. Realizing the danger, Henry deliberately draws the shooter's attention away from Danny and Baron so they can escape safely. A tense firefight erupts between the two marksmen, but something immediately feels wrong. The enemy sniper moves exactly like Henry. Same instincts, same reactions, same precision. When Henry finally gets a clear look at the attacker, he's stunned. The assassin looks exactly like him, only decades younger. The mysterious operative, known as Junior, possesses nearly identical combat abilities, reflexes, and sniper skills, almost as if he were Henry's mirror image. Fighting someone who thinks and moves exactly the same way leaves Henry completely overwhelmed. Henry eventually steals a motorcycle and speeds through the streets in an attempt to escape, but Junior immediately pursues him on another bike. What follows is an intense high-speed chase through the crowded city as Junior relentlessly closes the distance between them. Despite Henry's experience, Junior proves nearly impossible to shake. The younger assassin finally crashes into Henry, sending him flying violently off the motorcycle. Junior approaches to finish the job, but before he can pull the trigger, local police suddenly flood the scene. Henry is arrested on the spot while Junior disappears before anyone can identify him. Thankfully, Danny manages to secure Henry's release shortly afterward. With nowhere else to turn, the team travels to Budapest in search of Yuri, Dell's informant, hoping he can explain the truth behind Gemini and Junior. During the journey, Danny brings up the obvious resemblance between Henry and the younger assassin, unable to ignore how identical they look. Henry refuses to entertain the idea, brushing it off and denying any possibility that Junior could somehow be related to him. Meanwhile, after escaping the fight in Colombia, Junior returns to Clay Verris' estate to recover from his injuries. Even though he managed to overpower Henry during the chase, he can't stop thinking about the older sniper's abilities. For the first time in his life, Junior has encountered someone who matches him move for move, and the experience clearly unsettles him. Still, he hasn't fully noticed the disturbing resemblance between them, especially their nearly identical faces. Clay quickly steps in to calm him down. Acting more like a caring father than a commander, he reassures Junior that everything is under control and reminds him how special he is. Clay knows exactly how to manipulate him emotionally, feeding him praise and affection while strengthening the bond between them. Later, Clay walks Junior through Gemini's training facilities, proudly showing off squads of highly trained mercenaries preparing for combat. The entire operation is built around creating superior soldiers, and Junior is presented as the ultimate achievement. Once Junior is mentally back on track, Clay sends him to Budapest to continue hunting Henry. After arriving in the city, Danny reconnects with one of her trusted contacts, a woman named Aniko. She secretly hands over biological samples collected from Junior and asks for a full DNA analysis. While the others wait anxiously, Aniko completes the test and delivers shocking results. Junior and Henry share completely identical DNA. There's no mistake, Junior is literally Henry's clone. The revelation leaves everyone stunned, especially Henry himself. Even after everything he's seen, he struggles to process the truth standing in front of him. Soon after, Henry, Danny, and Baron finally meet Yuri, the informant who possesses the missing pieces of the puzzle. Yuri explains that Dormov had once been deeply involved in Gemini's cloning experiments. According to him, Henry unknowingly played a major role in the project years earlier. Clay secretly used Henry's genetic material as the foundation for an entirely new generation of engineered assassins. Yuri further reveals that Dormov eventually made a scientific breakthrough while working on the program, but he and Clay clashed over the project's direction. Dormov believed cloning should never be used to strip away humanity, while Clay wanted soldiers incapable of fear, guilt, pain, or emotional weakness. Horrified by Clay's vision, Dormov abandoned the project altogether. That decision ultimately signed his death warrant. Henry had been manipulated into killing him to keep the truth buried forever. With the truth finally exposed, the group moves on to their next step. Henry devises a way to pressure Lassiter directly. He sends a messenger to her office carrying detailed information about her personal daily routines, proof that he can reach her whenever he wants. The message terrifies her instantly. Shortly afterward, Henry personally calls her and proposes a deal. He agrees to stop targeting her if she arranges a meeting with Junior and guarantees Danny's safety in return. With few options left, Lassiter accepts the terms and organizes the encounter. That night, Junior secretly approaches Danny alone inside a garden before the meeting begins. Suspicious that she might be wired, he carefully searches her to ensure she isn't transmitting information. But instead of following the agreed plan, Junior suddenly changes the rules. He kidnaps Danny and drags her into a tunnel system, then contacts Henry and orders him to come alone if he wants her alive. When Henry arrives, he immediately notices the entrance has been rigged with a grenade trap. Using his instincts and experience, he narrowly avoids triggering the explosion and pushes deeper inside. Eventually, he corners Junior and manages to free Danny, but rather than killing the younger assassin, Henry hesitates. The more he looks at Junior, the more he feels an undeniable connection between them. He tells Junior he doesn't want to hurt him unless absolutely necessary. Henry then tries to expose the truth about Clay. He points out the strange similarities they share, identical allergies to bee venom, the same combat instincts, the same habits, even the same emotional emptiness after taking a life. Junior refuses to believe any of it, convinced Henry is manipulating him. Finally, Henry is forced to reveal everything directly. He explains that 25 years earlier, Clay secretly took his DNA and used it to create Junior as a replacement once Henry became too old to serve Gemini's needs. The revelation shakes Junior badly. For the first time, doubt begins creeping into his mind, though he still struggles to fully accept it. Emotions boil over, and the two clash once again in a brutal hand-to-hand fight. During the battle, Danny gets a clear shot at Junior, but Henry stops her from pulling the trigger. Even after everything that's happened, he can't bring himself to let Junior die. Junior nearly kills Henry during the confrontation, but Danny intervenes at the last second, giving Henry enough time to survive. Junior ultimately escapes, while Henry, Danny, and Baron decide there's only one move left: confront Clay directly at Gemini headquarters in Georgia. Back at Gemini, Junior storms into Clay's office demanding the truth. This time, Clay no longer denies it. He openly admits that Junior was engineered from Henry's DNA and raised under carefully controlled lies. But rather than apologizing, Clay insists everything was necessary to make him stronger. As always, he wraps the manipulation in fake affection, claiming he only ever wanted what was best for his son. Once Henry and the others arrive in Georgia, Junior unexpectedly intercepts them. To prove Henry was telling the truth about their shared genetics, Junior injects him with bee venom, knowing Henry's severe allergy would trigger immediately. After watching Henry collapse, Junior quickly revives him using an EpiPen. The test confirms it beyond doubt. They truly are biologically identical. Finally accepting reality, Junior decides to join forces with Henry and help destroy Clay's operation once and for all. As they travel together, Henry begins opening up about his past and the emptiness caused by years of violence. He warns Junior not to follow the same miserable path that ruined his own life. Instead, he encourages him to find a real purpose beyond being a weapon, but Clay still refuses to let them go. While the group drives toward a nearby town, Clay secretly contacts Junior and orders him to jump out of the vehicle immediately. Seconds later, the reason becomes horrifyingly clear. A hidden tank fires a missile directly at their car. The explosion completely destroys the vehicle. Baron is killed in the blast, though Henry, Danny, and Junior barely manage to escape before impact. Moments later, squads of Gemini soldiers swarm into the town, launching a full-scale ambush. Among them is a heavily armored operative wearing a mask and carrying a devastating machine gun. Henry and Danny fight desperately through the streets, taking down mercenaries one after another, but the enemy numbers seem endless. Eventually, they're forced to retreat into a nearby house. Danny suffers a gunshot wound to the leg, and the group soon realizes they're nearly out of ammunition. At the same time, Junior confronts Clay one final time, demanding he call off the assault. Clay coldly insists Henry must die for Gemini to survive. This time, however, Junior refuses to obey. Furious, he attacks Clay directly, knocks him unconscious, and rushes off to help Henry and Danny before it's too late. Junior arrives just in time and helps eliminate the remaining mercenaries, but then the masked super soldier emerges again. Despite facing all three of them alone, the armored assassin shrugs off bullets like they're nothing. Danny even attempts to burn him alive, but the soldier walks straight through the flames unaffected. With no other option left, Junior grabs a heavy weapon and unloads everything he has into the unstoppable enemy until the armored figure finally collapses. When they remove the mask, they make a horrifying discovery. The soldier is yet another clone of Henry, this one even younger than Junior, stripped almost entirely of emotion and humanity. Shortly afterward, Clay regains consciousness and confronts the group. Instead of showing regret, he proudly tells Henry he should feel honored because Gemini was inspired entirely by him. Clay explains that his true goal was always to create perfect soldiers incapable of fear or pain so that American lives would never again be lost in war. Enraged, Junior points a gun at Clay and prepares to kill him. But Henry stops him at the last second. He refuses to let Junior carry the same emotional scars and guilt that destroyed his own life. Henry takes the gun himself and finally executes Clay, ending the nightmare personally. Following Clay's death, the Gemini program is permanently shut down, and the remaining clones are taken into custody and cared for properly. In the final scenes, Henry reunites with Danny at a college campus where Junior has officially started a new life under the name Jackson Brogan, using Henry's mother's maiden name as his own. No longer treated like a weapon or experiment, Jackson finally has a real identity and chooses to pursue a future studying engineering, leaving his violent past behind in search of something better. There are certain film concepts that immediately activate your imagination before a single frame has even appeared on screen. Gemini Man was absolutely one of those projects for me. The premise alone feels engineered to capture attention. Will Smith portraying an aging government operative being pursued by a younger version of himself. It's the kind of large-scale science fiction thriller Hollywood used to produce regularly in the late 90s and early 2000s, only this time supported by technology advanced enough to finally attempt the idea convincingly. Or at least that was the promise surrounding it. And honestly, the film had an impressive amount of momentum, working in its favor long before audiences stepped into theaters. You had Ang Lee directing, which still feels slightly surreal when you stop and think about it. This is the filmmaker behind Brokeback Mountain, Life of Pi, and Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon, not exactly the first creative voice most people would associate with a clone assassin blockbuster. But sometimes that contrast is exactly what makes a project feel exciting. You start convincing yourself that a director with that kind of sensibility might bring something more reflective to the material. Something stranger, more emotionally layered, maybe even more philosophical than the average action spectacle. Then there's Will Smith. Whatever conversations people may have now about his career choices, there was a long stretch of time when Will Smith leading a film automatically made it feel like a cultural event. Especially within this specific lane. Confident action hero, charismatic without trying too hard, emotionally grounded beneath the spectacle, that was a space he occupied effortlessly for years. So naturally expectations started building very quickly. The marketing leaned heavily into the entire Will Smith versus Will Smith concept, and I remember thinking this could either become something genuinely memorable or collapse under the weight of its own ambition. There never really seemed to be much middle ground, because if the younger digital version worked, even most of the time, the movie immediately had a unique identity. But beyond the technical achievement, the premise itself carried legitimate thematic potential. There's something deeply uncomfortable about the idea of being pursued by a younger version of yourself. A version with sharper reflexes, more confidence, fewer regrets, and the certainty that comes from still believing you're untouchable. It naturally opens the door to ideas about aging, ego, insecurity, and self-perception in ways mainstream action thrillers rarely pause long enough to explore. Imagine being forced into conflict with the version of yourself that still sees invincibility as a permanent condition. That's actually a fascinating psychological setup, and the film's marketing occasionally hinted at those deeper ideas too. You hear about cloning programs, covert government operations, aging operatives being replaced by engineered successors, and suddenly it starts sounding less like a standard pursuit thriller and more like science fiction with genuine thematic ambition underneath it. At least that was the hope. Because honestly, when I first sat down to watch Gemini Man, I wasn't expecting a masterpiece. I wasn't looking for some profoundly philosophical experience either. I simply thought it had all the ingredients necessary to become one of those highly rewatchable science fiction action films people gradually appreciate more with time. The kind where the central concept and execution are strong enough to carry the occasional narrative absurdity. And for a brief stretch early on, the movie almost convinces you that's exactly where it's heading. What's interesting about Gemini Man is that the clone concept itself is not the issue. In many ways, it's the one element carrying the film through most of its runtime. Once Henry finally confronts Junior face to face, the movie suddenly becomes compelling in an entirely different way. Not necessarily because of the action sequences, not even because of the visual effects. It's the psychology underneath everything that becomes unexpectedly engaging, because Junior isn't simply young evil Will Smith. He's essentially a manufactured human being raised from the beginning to function as a weapon. Younger, physically superior, more aggressive, and conditioned for obedience. But beneath all of that programming, he's still a deeply confused young man slowly realizing his entire existence was constructed by people who view him as an asset rather than a person. And honestly, that's a much darker idea than the film fully acknowledges. There are moments where Gemini Man moves right to the edge of genuinely rich emotional territory before immediately retreating from it. Henry begins looking at Junior less like an enemy and more like a tragic reflection of himself, almost as if he's staring at the version of his life that was lost before it even had the chance to unfold differently. You can feel the film wanting to explore regret, aging, identity, and the anxiety of becoming obsolete in a world obsessed with replacement. There's even a quiet sadness running beneath some of their conversations, because Henry already understands where this path ultimately leads. Junior doesn't, and honestly, that dynamic alone probably could have sustained the strongest version of the entire film. Strip away the oversized conspiracy mechanics for a moment. Forget the endless layers of government betrayal. The most compelling version of Gemini Man may have simply been these two characters confronting each other more directly. Less spectacle, more conversation. An older Henry trying to prevent this younger version from becoming the same emotionally hollow operative he eventually became. There's something genuinely human inside that idea. Especially once you realize Junior has never really been allowed to exist as an individual. He's treated as a replacement model, a more efficient design, less emotional, more precise. The film quietly starts asking whether experience, memory, and humanity still matter once systems become capable of manufacturing younger, optimized versions of people. That's an incredibly strong science fiction concept. The problem is the film never fully trusts it. Every time Gemini Man begins moving towards something emotionally engaging, it seems to panic and immediately redirect itself back into another chase sequence or large-scale confrontation. It's almost as though the movie becomes nervous that audiences might lose interest if it slows down long enough to let these characters actually breathe. And that becomes frustrating because some of the emotional material genuinely works despite the screenplay constantly interrupting itself. There's an awkward tension in the way Junior studies Henry, part curiosity, part resentment, part insecurity, like he's trying to determine whether this older version of himself represents weakness or the first honest thing he's ever encountered in his entire life. To Will Smith's credit, he actually sells portions of that dynamic surprisingly well, especially during the quieter scenes where the film briefly stops trying so aggressively to prove itself as a blockbuster. But then the screenplay undercuts those moments with dialogue that overexplains everything or scenes that conclude just as they begin finding emotional weight. You can almost sense entire layers of missing character depth sitting underneath the surface. And throughout the film, I kept returning to the same thought. Why wasn't the movie more interested in this? Because cloning itself is hardly new territory within science fiction. Secret laboratories, engineered operatives, covert military experiments, audiences have seen those ideas countless times before. What makes Gemini Man distinct is the emotional angle buried underneath the premise. The idea of a man confronting the weaponized version of his younger self before that younger self even understands what he's becoming. That's the version of the movie I wanted more of. Not necessarily deeper in an overly self-important way. Just more emotionally committed, more personal, more willing to slow down and let the central idea fully breathe instead of constantly reassuring the audience that it's still an action spectacle. And strangely enough, the film occasionally seems aware of this itself. There are brief moments where everything suddenly aligns for a few minutes at a time. Junior stops feeling like a visual effects gimmick and starts feeling like a genuinely tragic character. Henry stops feeling like another generic, retired operative and starts resembling a man forced to confront the emotional cost of his own life. Then the movie moves away from those moments before they're allowed to fully land. That's probably the most frustrating thing about Gemini Man, not that the clone concept failed. It's that the emotional potential was sitting directly in front of the film the entire time, and it never completely committed to it. Honestly, the biggest mystery in Gemini Man isn't the cloning. It's Ang Lee. I spent almost the entire runtime trying to figure out what exactly attracted Ang Lee to this project beyond the technology itself. Because Gemini Man never really feels like an Ang Lee film in the way people typically mean that. It doesn't carry the emotional precision that defines his strongest work. It lacks the quiet tension and layered humanity you feel in films like Brokeback Mountain or The Ice Storm. Instead, this feels more like a filmmaker becoming fascinated with machinery rather than emotional storytelling. And maybe that sounds slightly severe, but the film almost invites that reaction. You can clearly sense Lee's interest in the technical side of filmmaking throughout the entire project. The high frame rate presentation, the ultra-clean digital photography, the fully CGI younger version of Will Smith, the 3D experimentation, all of that obviously mattered to him. Honestly, it often feels like those elements mattered more than the screenplay itself, because the movie carries this unusual energy where it sometimes resembles a demonstration of cinematic technology more than a fully realized dramatic experience. And to be fair, from a purely technical perspective, portions of it are undeniably impressive. Some shots look extraordinarily sharp, at times almost distractingly sharp. Every texture, every reflection, every subtle facial movement becomes hypervisible. The action sequences especially feel designed around showcasing that level of visual clarity. But after a while, I started noticing something strange. The more technically real the movie appeared, the less emotionally authentic it began to feel. That high frame rate presentation gives certain scenes an almost behind-the-scenes quality. At times it feels less like you're being absorbed into a cinematic world, and more like you're watching actors standing inside highly detailed sets under extremely advanced lighting systems. It removes some of the texture and atmosphere that usually help action thrillers feel immersive. Certain moments genuinely resemble live television, blended with a high-end video game cinematic. Now I understand why some people appreciated the experimentation. And honestly, I do respect Lee for attempting something ambitious instead of simply drifting through another studio production on autopilot. At least he's taking creative risks. Modern Hollywood rarely rewards unusual technical ambition anymore. But the issue is that none of the experimentation solves the film's central problem. The story itself simply isn't strong enough. So what ultimately happens is Lee pours enormous creative energy into presentation, while the emotional foundation underneath everything continues feeling strangely underdeveloped. There are scenes where the filmmaking visually insists that something profound is happening, while the actual screenplay beneath those images has very little emotional substance to support it. That disconnect becomes especially noticeable during dialogue-heavy scenes. Characters discuss cloning, purpose, fear, aging, identity, themes that should land with genuine emotional weight. But Lee directs many of those moments with such clinical restraint that they never fully settle into something affecting. Everything feels oddly controlled, too polished, too sterile. And that's unusual because Ang Lee's best films are almost always human first. Even when they're visually stunning, the emotional truth comes before the spectacle. Here, it feels reversed. Like the technology slowly became the main attraction, while the characters drifted into secondary importance. Honestly, there were moments during Gemini Man where I briefly forgot this was made by a two-time Academy Award-winning filmmaker. Not because the movie feels incompetent, it doesn't, but because it feels strangely anonymous. You could easily tell someone this was directed by a technically skilled studio filmmaker for hire, and they probably wouldn't question it. There's surprisingly little personality in the action staging, very little tension in the quieter exchanges. Even the emotional interactions between Henry and Junior, which should absolutely form the emotional core of the film, sometimes feel rushed aside because the movie is already preparing for the next technological showcase. And that becomes frustrating because buried underneath all the digital experimentation, you occasionally catch flashes of the older Ang Lee, tiny moments where the film suddenly slows down and becomes reflective. You notice traces of loneliness in Henry, confusion in Junior, a quiet sadness hidden underneath the science fiction framework. Those moments genuinely work, but the movie never fully commits to them. Instead, it continually circles back toward its own gimmick. Look at the de-aging technology. Look at the motion clarity. Look how realistic young Will Smith appears under this lighting setup. And eventually, I found myself less emotionally invested in the characters and increasingly aware of the filmmaking process itself. That's rarely a good sign for a movie built around immersion. What's interesting is that I actually think another director probably would have made a much louder, more chaotic version of Gemini Man. More oversized spectacle, more forced humor, more aggressively edited action. Lee at least tries to approach the material with seriousness. The issue is that his seriousness collides with material that already feels emotionally hollow, so the entire film becomes trapped in this awkward middle space. Too emotionally distant to function as great drama, too restrained to become a genuinely exhilarating action spectacle, and too fascinated with technology to ever fully disappear into its own story. Watching Gemini Man also becomes unexpectedly fascinating because the film accidentally transforms into a conversation about Will Smith himself, not just the character he's portraying him as a movie star. Because the entire narrative is built around the idea of an older version confronting a younger version at his physical and professional peak. And once you cast Will Smith specifically in that role, an additional layer immediately forms whether the movie intends it or not. You're not simply watching Henry Brogan confront his younger self. You're watching modern Will Smith stare directly at the version of himself that dominated Hollywood for years. And honestly, that aspect of the film is strangely compelling. There was a long period where Will Smith simply could not miss, or at least that's how it felt culturally. Even films that weren't particularly strong still became major events because his presence alone elevated them. Men in Black, Independence Day, Enemy of the State, I, Robot, Bad Boys. He had that increasingly rare movie star quality where sheer charisma could carry average material further than it deserved to go. That's why Gemini Man occasionally feels unintentionally meta. The younger version of Smith is faster, smoother, more physically dominant, more relentless. The older version is exhausted, emotionally worn down, constantly reassessing himself. Obviously, that dynamic serves the plot, but there are moments where it almost feels like the movie commenting on Smith's real career trajectory as well. Especially because by the time Gemini Man arrived, audiences had already spent years having conversations about his increasingly uneven project choices. Films like After Earth and Bright contributed to this growing perception that he kept selecting concepts that sounded exciting in development meetings, but never fully came together as complete films. And Gemini Man absolutely feels like one of those projects. What's frustrating is that Smith himself really isn't the problem. Honestly, he's making a sincere effort. As older Henry, he delivers a surprisingly restrained performance. He tones down much of his larger-than-life charisma and plays the character with visible exhaustion. Henry doesn't feel dramatically broken so much as emotionally depleted. There's a quiet sadness underneath him that works in the film's stronger scenes. You believe this is someone who has spent decades doing morally corrosive work for institutions that never truly valued him as a person. And Smith still possesses natural charisma, even when the screenplay is actively working against him. That's the thing about performers like him. Even weak dialogue becomes slightly more engaging because he instinctively understands rhythm, charm, and audience connection better than most actors operating inside blockbuster material. Now, does he completely elevate the screenplay? Not really. Honestly, I'm not convinced anyone could, but he absolutely prevents the movie from fully collapsing under its own weight. Junior is where things become more complicated. Because technically it's still Will Smith's performance underneath all the digital reconstruction, but the CGI recreation creates this strange emotional barrier at times. There are scenes where Junior genuinely feels alive, angry, insecure, emotionally disoriented in a way that actually gives the character dimension. Will Smith does a surprisingly effective job distinguishing him from Henry. Junior feels younger, more impulsive, more emotionally unstable. You can sense the lack of life experience in the way he reacts to everything around him, but then the CGI steps in and interrupts the performance. You'll find yourself emotionally invested in a scene for a moment, and then Junior turns his head at a slightly unnatural angle or a facial expression moves just a little too mechanically, and your brain immediately snaps back into awareness. Right, this is digital. It becomes difficult to completely ignore once you notice it. Still, some of the scenes between the two versions of Smith are honestly the strongest material in the film. Not because of the spectacle itself, but because Smith plays the emotional dynamic more thoughtfully than the screenplay probably deserves. Older Henry doesn't spend most of the movie looking at Junior like an enemy. Half the time he looks at him with pity, maybe even regret, like he already understands exactly how this young man's future ends. And Junior slowly realizing that he's essentially been manufactured as a replacement for another human being gives the film emotional weight it desperately needs. I actually think Smith deserves more credit for making those scenes function at all, because on paper, actor confronts younger CGI version of himself could have become unintentionally ridiculous very quickly. Somehow he manages to keep portions of it emotionally grounded. At the same time though, the movie also unintentionally exposes how much Will Smith benefits from strong material surrounding him. Back during his peak years, his charisma could often overpower weaker scripts because the films themselves still carried momentum and personality. Here, the screenplay feels so thin and the direction so emotionally distant that even Smith struggles to generate energy consistently. You can feel him trying to inject humor, warmth, rhythm, and humanity into scenes, and the movie simply absorbs it without ever fully coming alive. And that's why Gemini Man ends up feeling less like a major reinvention and more like another example of Smith becoming trapped inside high-concept projects that sound far more compelling in theory than they do in execution. Which is unfortunate because there are still flashes of the old movie star magnetism throughout the film. Certain line deliveries, small reactions, quiet moments where Henry simply looks exhausted by the entire world around him. Those scenes remind you why Will Smith became such a dominant screen presence in the first place. He's naturally watchable. Even inside flawed films, your attention stays locked onto him. But Gemini Man also quietly reveals something else. A great movie star can absolutely elevate weak material. They just can't completely rescue a film that never fully understood itself to begin with. And honestly, we have to talk about the CGI directly because the entire movie more or less succeeds or fails based on whether audiences accept the illusion of the younger Will Smith. That's the central selling point. The trailers understood it, the marketing understood it, Ang Lee definitely understood it. This wasn't being presented as just another science fiction thriller. The movie was marketed almost like a technological milestone. Like audiences were supposed to walk out discussing what cinema had just achieved technically. And to be fair, there are moments where the effect genuinely is impressive. There are shots where young Will Smith looks convincing enough that your brain temporarily relaxes and accepts the illusion completely. Especially in darker scenes or intimate close-ups where the lighting naturally hides certain imperfections. For a few seconds at a time, you almost stop thinking about the technology altogether. Then he smiles in a slightly unnatural way. Or turns too quickly, or the lighting shifts, and suddenly the illusion collapses again. That's the frustrating thing about the CGI in Gemini Man. It's rarely consistently bad, but it's also almost never fully convincing. It exists inside this strange middle space where your brain keeps shifting between admiration and discomfort every few minutes. One moment you're thinking, that's genuinely impressive. The next moment something feels subtly unnatural, and the entire illusion weakens again. And once you start noticing that inconsistency, it becomes impossible to stop looking for it. The eyes are usually the biggest giveaway. Sometimes they carry that slightly empty digital quality where movement exists, but emotional life underneath the movement doesn't fully register. The mouth occasionally becomes distracting too, especially during emotionally vulnerable scenes. Which is interesting because the movie works incredibly hard to make Junior look physically realistic, but emotional realism is exactly where the effect struggles most. Ironically, the action scenes often disguise the CGI better than the dialogue scenes do. During sequences like the motorcycle pursuit, your attention naturally shifts toward speed, movement, choreography, and impact, rather than analyzing facial details frame by frame. But the second the film slows down for emotional conversations, the technology faces much harsher scrutiny. And honestly, I don't think the high frame rate presentation helped the situation at all. If anything, I think it made everything harder to accept. The entire 120 FPS presentation gives the movie this ultra-smooth, hyper-clear image that removes much of the cinematic softness audiences are accustomed to. Some people compared it to a soap opera or behind-the-scenes footage, and I understand exactly why. Everything becomes too visible. Every texture, every digital adjustment, every visual effect suddenly exists under a microscope. Traditional film grain naturally conceals imperfections. Gemini Man does the exact opposite. It essentially places the CGI under stadium lighting and says, study every detail, which becomes a dangerous creative decision when your film depends this heavily on digital human performances. And what's strange is that the movie almost starts feeling less realistic because of how visually sharp everything becomes. Technically clearer, technically smoother, technically more detailed. Yet emotionally and visually, the entire experience starts feeling increasingly artificial, like reality filtered through advanced software. There were honestly moments where the movie resembled a technology presentation more than a finished cinematic experience. Here's what filmmaking may look like in 10 years, and that's interesting for a little while. But eventually you still need a compelling story underneath all of it. That's where Gemini Man struggles most. Because the technology gradually becomes the primary thing you're thinking about, not the characters, not the tension, not the emotional stakes. You spend the film subconsciously analyzing visuals instead of becoming immersed in the narrative. Every scene with Junior turns into a test. Does he look convincing here? Why does this angle work better than the previous one? Why does the lighting suddenly make him look less real? You end up studying the effect instead of emotionally experiencing the performance. And honestly, that's a major problem for a movie built around identity, regret, and human connection. What makes it even more ironic is that portions of the regular cinematography are genuinely beautiful. Certain nighttime sequences look stunning. The locations feel large-scale and cinematic. Even the sound design during the gunfights is incredibly polished. There's clearly real craftsmanship throughout parts of the production, but the digital presentation creates this strange disconnect where everything feels simultaneously expensive and artificial at the same time. Like the movie exists inside a highly polished simulation. And look, I genuinely do give the film credit for taking such an ambitious technological risk. Seriously. Hollywood rarely attempts experiments on this scale anymore, and Gemini Man at least tried something genuinely difficult. A fully digital younger lead actor interacting throughout an entire feature film is not a minor achievement, even if the final result remains uneven. But I also think the movie arrived slightly too early. You can feel the technology almost working, almost crossing the line into something seamless, but almost becomes dangerous when the emotional core of your film depends on audiences completely forgetting the effect exists. Because the moment the illusion breaks, even briefly, the emotional scene breaks with it. And by the time the film reaches its conclusion, I honestly wasn't thinking very much about Henry or Junior anymore. I was thinking about the experiment itself, whether the technology succeeded, whether this represents the future of filmmaking, whether actors will eventually exist digitally forever, which is fascinating in its own way, I suppose. But probably not the emotional response the movie hoped audiences would leave with. Honestly, the deeper you get into Gemini Man, the more you realize the movie's biggest issue isn't actually the CGI at all. The deeper you get into Gemini Man, the clearer it becomes that the film's biggest issue was never really the CGI. It's the screenplay. Because even if the digital effects had been absolutely flawless, genuinely seamless in every frame, there would still be this strangely generic, oddly outdated action thriller sitting underneath everything. And the movie never fully escapes that reality. The premise itself sounds immediately compelling, an aging assassin being pursued by his younger clone, instantly intriguing. But the actual story built around that concept feels like something recovered from a forgotten stack of late 90s studio scripts. And apparently, that's not far from the truth. You can feel it throughout the entire film. The structure relies heavily on that familiar rogue government operation formula audiences have seen countless times before. Secret agencies manipulating operatives, shadow programs, satellite surveillance. Corrupt military contractors discussing the creation of perfect soldiers. Characters realizing they've been betrayed by the institutions they trusted. None of those elements are inherently flawed on their own, but Gemini Man never brings a fresh perspective to any of them. Everything unfolds exactly one step ahead of the audience in the least interesting way possible. The film introduces a setup, and your brain immediately predicts where it's going. That character is obviously corrupt. That reveal is definitely coming later. And then, inevitably, that exact thing happens. There's very little surprise in the storytelling. The dialogue doesn't help either. Some conversations genuinely feel like early exposition drafts that somehow survived all the way into the finished film. Characters constantly explain what they're feeling instead of allowing emotions to emerge naturally. Every thematic idea becomes overarticulated. Every plot point gets repeated multiple times, as if the movie is worried audiences might miss something. There are moments where Gemini Man almost feels insecure about its own concept. It continually pauses to explain cloning, morality, identity, trauma, government corruption, but rarely explores any of those ideas deeply enough to make the conversations memorable. Characters discuss interesting themes more often than the film actually dramatizes them. And because the screenplay depends so heavily on exposition, it repeatedly destroys its own momentum. You'll get a reasonably effective action sequence, tension finally begins building, and then suddenly everyone is standing inside another safe house explaining the plot again. The rhythm becomes awkward. The movie constantly pauses itself. Instead of flowing naturally, it lurches from scene to scene trying to hold its conspiracy narrative together. Even the emotional scenes become weighed down by clumsy writing. There are moments between Henry and Junior that genuinely could have landed with emotional force, but the screenplay almost never trusts silence. Somebody always ends up verbally explaining the theme moments later. It's as if the movie doesn't believe the audience will understand its ideas unless the characters directly state them aloud. And strangely enough, nearly every major character feels underwritten. Henry is essentially retired assassin carrying regret. Junior is emotionally conflicted clone. Clay is military strategist obsessed with superior soldiers. Danny mostly exists to move alongside Henry through the plot. Very few characters evolve in surprising or emotionally layered ways. They function more like narrative pieces than fully realized people. Clive Owen especially suffers from this limitation, because there's actually a potentially compelling antagonist hidden inside Clay Varys, a man who genuinely believes emotions weaken soldiers, someone obsessed with engineering humanity into pure efficiency. That's genuinely dark science fiction territory, but the movie barely develops him beyond standard mastermind material. Half the time he feels less like a character and more like someone hired to explain the plot every 20 minutes. And honestly, the film accidentally weakens its own moral conflict in the process. There were moments where I genuinely found myself wondering, wait, why exactly is the clone program such an obviously catastrophic idea again? Obviously, the movie wants audiences to reject it, but it never fully constructs a convincing emotional or philosophical argument beyond the vague instinct that it feels morally wrong. Meanwhile, the antagonists keep discussing the elimination of fear, trauma, and emotional instability through engineered perfection, and the screenplay never meaningfully counters those ideas in a thoughtful way. That's fundamentally a writing issue. The emotional logic underneath the story feels incomplete. Even the humor struggles because of the screenplay. Will Smith naturally possesses excellent comedic timing. Everyone already knows that, but most of the jokes here land with surprisingly little impact. Some of the banter feels strangely manufactured, almost like the script suddenly remembered halfway through production that audiences associate Will Smith with charm and humor. And there's another issue too. The movie never fully commits to any single version of itself. It isn't intellectually ambitious enough to become great science fiction. It isn't emotionally committed enough to become compelling drama. It isn't dynamic enough to become genuinely exhilarating action entertainment. It simply hovers in the middle of all three. That's why the action sequences stand out whenever they actually work. Because for brief moments, the movie finally stops explaining itself and allows the concept to function visually. The motorcycle pursuit works better than most of the dialogue scenes because it's built on pure simplicity. Younger self hunting older self, instinct versus experience, no exposition required. The screenplay should have trusted that simplicity far more often. Instead, it continuously overcomplicates itself while somehow still feeling emotionally shallow at the same time, which is honestly almost impressive in a backwards kind of way. And by the final act, the movie drifts almost entirely into standard blockbuster autopilot. More soldiers, more gunfire, more generic confrontations. The psychological and emotional ideas that initially made the premise compelling gradually fade into the background until the film starts feeling interchangeable with countless other forgettable action thrillers. That's the real disappointment. Not necessarily that the screenplay fails scene by scene, although portions of it absolutely struggle, but because the premise deserved something sharper, something leaner, more emotionally focused. More confident in allowing the clone concept itself to carry the film instead of burying it beneath recycled conspiracy thriller material. Because underneath all the predictable plotting and heavy-handed exposition, you can still see the outline of a genuinely great science fiction film trying to emerge. The screenplay simply never allows it to breathe. One of the hardest things to define about Gemini Man is its tone, not because it's intentionally layered or complex or ambiguous in some brilliant way. More because the movie genuinely seems uncertain about what kind of film it wants to become from one scene to the next, and you feel that instability almost immediately. At first, the movie plays like a sleek old-school assassin thriller, retired operative, government betrayal, quiet sniper sequences, a little bit of the Bourne Identity, a little bit of James Bond energy. You start thinking maybe the film is aiming for that grounded espionage atmosphere. Then suddenly, it pivots into heavier science fiction territory with cloning, identity crises, manufactured humans, emotional conditioning, themes that should naturally push the movie towards something darker and more introspective. But then a few minutes later, somebody delivers a joke, the banter becomes lighter, Will Smith shifts back into charming action star mode, and the tone changes again. The movie keeps doing this repeatedly. And the strange thing is that none of the individual tonal directions are necessarily bad on their own. The problem is that they never fully merge into one coherent personality. Instead, Gemini Man feels like multiple different versions of itself, competing for dominance simultaneously. You can almost imagine several filmmakers creating entirely different interpretations of this exact screenplay. One version becomes a serious science fiction drama about aging, replacement, and identity. Another becomes a glossy blockbuster pursuit thriller. Another leans heavily into the emotional father-son dynamic between Henry and Junior. And somewhere else, there's a version that simply wants to be a stylish, Will Smith entertainment vehicle filled with polished action sequences. Gemini Man somehow attempts all of them at once. And that's exactly why the emotional scenes often feel strangely muted. The film introduces ideas that should land with real psychological weight, literally confronting a younger engineered version of yourself, but it rarely pauses long enough to let those emotions fully settle. Every scene feels eager to move toward the next action beat or plot reveal before the emotional tension has actually had time to resonate. Then the opposite problem happens too. Sometimes Gemini Man becomes so absorbed in conversations about cloning, trauma, identity, and engineered humanity that it forgets it's supposed to maintain momentum as an action thriller. The pacing slows down, characters begin over-explaining every emotional idea, and the energy quietly drains out of the room. There's this constant push and pull happening throughout the movie. And honestly, I think Will Smith contributes to that tonal tension in a fascinating way, because Smith naturally brings warmth, charisma, and accessibility into almost anything he appears in. Audiences instinctively associate him with humor, confidence, and entertainment value. So whenever the movie starts leaning too heavily into cold science fiction seriousness, his screen presence almost pulls the film back toward lighter blockbuster territory automatically. The screenplay never fully adjusts around that dynamic, so you end up with scenes where characters are discussing cloning ethics and existential identity crises, immediately followed by banter that feels like it wandered in from an entirely different film. Even the humor feels affected by that tonal confusion. Not necessarily terrible, just misplaced. Like the movie itself isn't entirely sure when it wants audiences to laugh versus when it wants them emotionally invested. And strangely enough, the action suffers from the same identity crisis. Some sequences aim for grounded tactical realism. Others suddenly shift into exaggerated CGI-heavy spectacle. One moment the movie wants careful realism. The next moment motorcycles are launching through the air, like the film briefly transformed into a superhero blockbuster for 30 seconds. That tonal inconsistency creates emotional distance. The darker scenes never go deep enough to become genuinely haunting. The action sequences never become bold enough to feel unforgettable. The emotional moments never linger long enough to leave a lasting impact. Everything feels slightly restrained by the film's uncertainty about what it actually wants to be. And honestly, I think that's part of the reason Gemini Man ultimately feels so forgettable despite having such a strong central concept. Movies with unusual tonal shifts can absolutely work when they commit confidently enough to their identity. But Gemini Man constantly feels hesitant, like it's testing audience reactions in real time instead of fully embracing a clear creative direction. There were multiple moments where I genuinely wished the film had simply chosen one lane and committed to it completely. If you want serious science fiction drama, great. Push the clone relationship into genuinely uncomfortable emotional territory. Make Henry feel haunted by Junior in a deeply personal way. Let the film become reflective and psychologically intense. If you want a fun large-scale action movie, that's completely fine too. Lean into the absurdity. Let Will Smith's charisma fully drive the experience and focus on delivering unforgettable spectacle. But this constant middle ground approach leaves the entire movie feeling emotionally unfocused. And honestly, that emotionally unfocused feeling becomes the entire Gemini Man experience. You're never fully bored. But you're also never completely invested, never fully impressed, never fully moved. You just sort of drift through a movie that continually hints at stronger versions of itself without ever fully becoming one of them. Now, to be fair to Gemini Man, whenever the film finally stops over-explaining itself and simply allows the action to take over, it becomes noticeably more entertaining almost immediately. You can literally feel the movie wake up during certain sequences. The motorcycle pursuit is obviously the standout. That's the sequence everyone remembers, and honestly, it deserves that reputation. It's probably the one moment where the premise, pacing, and spectacle finally align properly for several uninterrupted minutes, because that chase actually uses the clone concept in an entertaining way. Junior isn't merely pursuing Henry physically, he's matching him instinctively. He understands how Henry thinks because he essentially is Henry. So the entire sequence carries this added layer where older experience is colliding with younger speed and aggression. Henry is trying to outmaneuver someone whose instincts mirror his own. That's a genuinely strong setup, and visually the sequence carries real momentum at first. Motorcycles weaving through narrow streets, bodies crashing through windows, gunfire erupting unexpectedly. The movie suddenly feels alive. For a brief stretch, Gemini Man finally resembles the sleek assassin thriller it clearly wanted to become. Now, does the CGI eventually become a little excessive by the end of the sequence? Absolutely. Once motorcycles start launching through the air like guided weapons, and Junior begins moving with borderline superhuman physics, the scene drifts dangerously close to cartoon territory. But honestly, I still had more fun during that sequence than during most of the dialogue-heavy sections combined. At least it had energy, and energy is something this movie desperately needs more consistently. The catacomb fight is another sequence that works surprisingly well, mostly because it strips everything down to its essentials. No elaborate conspiracy exposition, no extended philosophical discussions about cloning ethics. Just two versions of the same man violently confronting each other inside this claustrophobic underground environment. That sequence actually feels personal. You can feel Henry's exhaustion. You can feel Junior's anger. The fight is messy, physical, awkward in places, and honestly, that roughness helps considerably. It doesn't feel overly polished in that glossy superhero style where everyone patiently waits for their turn to attack. There's an uncomfortable physicality to it that gives the confrontation weight. And strangely enough, the movie is usually at its best when it becomes smaller like that rather than larger. Because some of the larger-scale action sequences don't leave much lasting impact at all. They're competently staged, certainly, but they also feel strangely familiar. Generic elite soldiers storming buildings, rooftop gunfights, tactical teams getting eliminated by the greatest assassin alive. Audiences have seen variations of these scenes countless times in other espionage thrillers. That's the recurring issue with Gemini Man. Even when the action works reasonably well, it rarely feels distinct enough to separate itself from stronger films in the genre. There's also a strange inconsistency in the choreography itself. Some scenes feel grounded and tactical. Others suddenly become exaggerated CGI spectacle. One moment Henry is carefully navigating cover and calculating angles like a trained professional, and the next moment somebody is flying across the screen with physics that belong inside a comic book adaptation. The tone of the action keeps shifting just like the tone of the movie overall. And honestly, I think the high frame rate presentation hurts portions of the spectacle too. Sometimes the hyperclear image makes everything feel overly exposed. You begin noticing stunt doubles, digital stitching, artificial movement, details your brain would normally ignore inside a traditional action film. There were moments where I wasn't thinking, that's an impressive stunt. I was thinking, that definitely wasn't a real human body moving naturally. And once action loses physical believability, tension disappears quickly. Still, I don't want to pretend the film completely fails as action entertainment, because that wouldn't really be accurate either. There are stretches where it absolutely works as lightweight blockbuster entertainment. Some shootouts are genuinely engaging. A few sniper sequences create real tension. Occasionally, the movie remembers it's supposed to be entertaining and finally loosens up a little. You especially feel that during the middle portion of the film. Once Henry and Junior begin directly colliding, the action naturally becomes more compelling because there's actual emotional context underneath it. These aren't just faceless enemies anymore. That's probably why the later action sequences become disappointing again. By the final act, the film drifts back toward generic blockbuster autopilot. More soldiers, more gunfire, more tactical squads existing primarily to be eliminated. The personal conflict that made the earlier confrontations compelling gradually disappears beneath increasingly standard blockbuster noise. And honestly, that's where Gemini Man starts losing me again, because the strongest action scenes aren't necessarily the loudest ones. They're the moments where the clone concept genuinely changes the dynamics of the conflict itself. Older Henry surviving through instinct, patience, and experience, while Junior overwhelms him with speed, aggression, and physical superiority. That imbalance is interesting. That's the film's actual identity. Whenever the movie leans into that dynamic, the action works. Whenever it drifts back into generic military shootouts with layers of CGI spectacle placed on top, it starts feeling interchangeable with countless other forgettable streaming thrillers. Still, credit where it's deserved, the film absolutely contains a handful of sequences that stay in your mind afterward. Maybe not because they're masterpieces, but because for brief stretches, you can finally glimpse the version of Gemini Man that could have become genuinely special. A leaner movie, a sharper movie, a more emotionally driven thriller where every confrontation actually carried personal meaning instead of simply filling space between exposition scenes. One thing that really stood out to me while watching Gemini Man is just how overqualified the cast feels for the material they've been handed. There are genuinely talented performers throughout this film. Actors who have carried far stronger projects before, and yet almost everyone here feels strangely underserved by the screenplay. It's like watching skilled performers trying to create fully formed personalities out of unfinished character sketches. Mary Elizabeth Winstead is probably the clearest example of that, because she's one of those performers who usually brings a grounded, natural energy to films, even when the writing surrounding her isn't particularly strong. She was excellent in 10 Cloverfield Lane, excellent in Fargo, and even in chaotic action material, she usually finds something emotionally human to hold on to. But here, Dani mostly functions as a narrative device. She exists to move alongside Henry, react to developments, ask questions on behalf of the audience, occasionally participate in action sequences, and not much beyond that. I've seen people debate whether she was miscast or simply underwritten, and honestly, I lean heavily toward the writing being the real issue, because the movie never fully defines who Dani actually is outside of capable government operative. There's almost no personal texture to her character. No memorable perspective, no emotional specificity strong enough to make her feel fully alive, and the chemistry with Will Smith is acceptable, not bad, not particularly memorable either. It exists. Which strangely becomes one of the film's recurring problems overall. Everything hovers around fine, nothing completely collapses, but very little truly catches fire either. Even the banter scenes feel slightly restrained, like the actors are trying to inject personality into conversations that never had much energy on the page to begin with. Clive Owen arguably has it even worse, because Clay Verris should theoretically be a genuinely compelling antagonist, a man obsessed with eliminating fear and emotional weakness from soldiers by engineering human beings into controlled weapons. There's real thematic material hidden inside that concept. He's essentially attempting to replace flawed humanity with manufactured perfection. That's disturbing, or at least it should be. But the film barely develops him beyond cold military scientist with control issues. So Clive Owen spends most of the runtime delivering exposition while wearing a permanent expression of exhausted frustration. You can feel him trying to give the character weight and seriousness, but the screenplay never provides enough depth for him to become memorable. And strangely enough, the movie occasionally makes him more understandable than it probably intends to. There are moments where you catch yourself thinking, the clone program is obviously unsettling, but the film also hasn't fully explained why this operation is uniquely horrifying compared to every other covert military project in this universe. That moral ambiguity actually could have been fascinating if the screenplay explored it intentionally. Instead, it just makes the central conflict feel underdeveloped. Honestly, Benedict Wong might be the only supporting actor who consistently escapes the movie relatively intact. Every time he appears, the energy immediately improves. He feels relaxed, human, like an actual person instead of a mechanism designed to deliver plot information. Even his smaller moments contain more warmth than entire sections of the film. It's not a massive role, but he brings an effortless likability that Gemini Man desperately needs. And honestly, that contrast accidentally exposes one of the screenplay's biggest weaknesses with supporting characters. Almost nobody feels like they have a life outside the plot itself. Dani exists because Henry requires an ally. Clay exists because the narrative requires an antagonist. Junior exists because the clone premise requires emotional conflict. But very few characters feel like real people who existed before the opening scene. There's almost no sense of lived-in history or personality beyond whatever information is immediately necessary for the current moment. That's why even the emotional scenes sometimes feel thinner than they should. The actors are doing what they can, but they're constantly fighting characters written more as archetypes than fully developed human beings. You can sense entire missing layers that either disappeared during development or perhaps never fully existed in the screenplay at all. And honestly, this cast deserved stronger material, because there are glimpses throughout the film of what a better version of Gemini Man could have looked like. A sharper screenplay could have transformed Dani into a genuinely compelling emotional anchor. A stronger script could have made Clay deeply unsettling instead of generic. Even some of the smaller supporting characters could have added texture and personality to the world instead of simply delivering information between action sequences. But Gemini Man becomes so focused on the clone gimmick and the technological side of the production that everyone surrounding Henry gradually fades into background noise. And that's part of why the film ultimately feels emotionally smaller than it should. Not because the actors are weak, they really aren't, but because the screenplay never gives most of them enough room to become memorable. And when a movie built around a concept, this strong can't make its supporting cast feel essential, the entire world surrounding the central idea starts feeling hollow too. If there's one area where Gemini Man consistently feels expensive, though, it's the visual presentation. Even people who strongly dislike the movie usually admit it at least looks like a major studio production. Ang Lee and cinematographer Dion Beebe clearly were not approaching this film cheaply. The locations alone give the movie a sense of scale it probably didn't entirely earn through storytelling. The narrative moves from Belgium to Colombia to Budapest, constantly chasing that global assassin thriller atmosphere. Old European streets, underground catacombs, rooftop skylines, isolated coastal hideouts. Visually, there's a lot of variety throughout the film. And honestly, some of the environments genuinely look beautiful. The catacomb section especially has a fantastic texture to it. Damp stone corridors, tight underground passageways, heavy shadows everywhere. For a few minutes, the movie almost slips into something moodier and more atmospheric than the rest of itself. Honestly, I kind of wish more of the film embraced that aesthetic, because visually, Gemini Man constantly feels split between beautiful and artificial, almost scene by scene. Some shots are genuinely stunning. Certain nighttime city sequences have this crisp neon-clean aesthetic that works extremely well for a modern espionage thriller. There are moments where the image becomes so sharp and detailed that it almost feels surreal. You can tell Ang Lee became obsessed with visual clarity here. Every reflection, every facial detail, every texture in the environment, everything is hypervisible, and initially that level of precision feels impressive. Then eventually, it starts becoming distracting. The film has this ultra-digital presentation that occasionally makes it feel less cinematic and more like you're watching reality through an extremely expensive display monitor. There's almost no softness to the image, no grit, no natural texture. Everything remains crystal clear at all times, which sounds impressive in theory, but in execution it creates this strange manufactured quality. The visuals become so polished that they stop disappearing naturally into the storytelling. Instead, you become constantly aware of the machinery behind the image itself. The cameras, the lighting setups, the digital enhancements, the frame rate, all the technical architecture supporting the presentation. And honestly, the high frame rate experiment completely changes the viewing experience. Some people absolutely rejected it because it makes movies feel less traditionally cinematic. Others found it immersive. I'm somewhere in the middle because there are moments where the visual clarity genuinely helps the action feel immediate and physical, but there are also scenes where it completely breaks the illusion, especially during effects-heavy sequences. The cleaner and sharper the image becomes, the harder it is to conceal imperfections. So whenever younger Will Smith looks slightly unnatural, or a CGI-enhanced stunt moment becomes too visible, the movie almost exposes its own tricks in real time. Traditional film language usually hides flaws organically through motion blur, grain, shadows, editing rhythm, and atmospheric texture. Gemini Man does the opposite. It places every visual element under a microscope. Sometimes that approach works beautifully. Other times it feels like watching unfinished visual effects rendered at maximum resolution. What's frustrating is that the actual cinematography underneath all the technical experimentation is often genuinely strong. Dion Beebe knows how to stage action clearly. The geography of scenes is almost always understandable. You consistently know where characters are positioned in relation to each other, which honestly has become increasingly rare in modern blockbuster filmmaking. The opening sniper sequence is a great example of that clarity. The movie carefully establishes distance, movement, positioning. You understand the mechanics of what Henry is doing. It isn't just chaotic shaky camera spectacle pretending to be intensity. Ang Lee clearly wanted precision in the action staging, but at the same time, that precision contributes to the movie feeling emotionally cold. And honestly, that's probably the best way to describe the visual style overall. Technically impressive, but emotionally distant. Everything feels carefully engineered. Very little feels spontaneous, messy, or genuinely alive. Even the color palette frequently leans towards sterile blues, grays, and hyperclean lighting setups that reinforce how artificial the world feels. Maybe that was intentional considering the cloning themes and the movie's obsession with manufactured humanity. But intentional doesn't automatically translate into emotionally effective. The sound design deserves genuine credit, though. The gunshots in this movie sound fantastic. There's real weight behind the action. Bullets crack aggressively through environments, punches land with impact, motorcycles tear through narrow streets with convincing force. from an audio standpoint, the film absolutely understands how to create physical intensity. The score is less memorable for me personally. Not bad, just functional. It fills scenes without significantly elevating them, which honestly describes large portions of Gemini Man overall. What makes the visual side especially frustrating is that it occasionally hints at a much stronger film hidden underneath all the technological experimentation. You catch little moments where the atmosphere suddenly clicks into place. A quiet nighttime sequence, a lonely wide shot of Henry isolated somewhere in silence, Junior standing partially in shadow, looking less like a digital recreation and more like an actual tragic figure. Those moments work because the visuals finally start serving emotion instead of technology, but the film never fully commits to that approach. Instead, it continually redirects attention back toward the presentation itself. Look at the frame rate. Look at the resolution. Look at the digital recreation. Look how advanced this all is. And eventually, the visual style becomes part of the film's larger issue. You admire it more than you emotionally experience it. It's polished. Expensive, technically ambitious. But somehow, despite all that visual clarity, the movie itself still feels strangely hollow. One of the reasons Gemini Man struggles to fully stand out is because the entire time you're watching it, your brain keeps drifting toward other movies that explored similar ideas more effectively. And I don't even mean that harshly. It just happens naturally because the film borrows from so many recognizable genres and concepts without ever completely transforming them into something uniquely its own. The second you hear aging assassin hunted by his younger counterpart, your mind immediately starts making connections. There's obvious Looper energy in there. Not literally the same premise. One uses time travel while the other uses cloning, but emotionally they occupy similar territory. Older men confronting younger versions connected directly to their own life choices. The difference is that Looper fully embraced the psychological discomfort and existential tension inside that setup, while Gemini Man mostly circles around those ideas without diving deeply into them. Then there's the unmistakable The Bourne Identity influence running throughout the movie. Retired government operatives, surveillance systems, burned assets, tactical teams, secret organizations creating highly efficient killers and then deciding they've become inconvenient liabilities. The entire structure feels deeply connected to that post-Bourne wave of espionage thrillers Hollywood became obsessed with for years. And honestly, that becomes part of the issue. A lot of Gemini Man feels less like a fresh science fiction thriller and more like a remix of ideas audiences have already seen executed elsewhere. Not necessarily bad ideas, just familiar ones. Sometimes the movie drifts into James Bond territory too, especially during the globetrotting sections. Exotic locations, rooftop pursuits, sleek cinematography, expensive-looking environments. You can almost imagine an alternate version of the film, leaning more confidently into stylish international espionage energy. But then it shifts again. There are moments where the movie suddenly starts feeling strangely close to modern superhero films, especially during some of the younger versus older Henry confrontations. Once the CGI becomes more exaggerated and characters start moving with increasingly unrealistic physics, portions of the movie almost resemble a Marvel-style mirror match fight sequence. And honestly, mirror match conflicts, whether they involve superheroes, clones, robots, or anything else, become visually repetitive very quickly unless there's strong emotional storytelling underneath them. Otherwise, it eventually becomes same character fighting same character repeatedly. That's why the emotional dimension mattered so much here. Strangely enough, there were even moments where I thought about the boys while watching Gemini Man. Not because the stories are directly similar, but because both explore corporations and governments manufacturing human weapons. The difference is that The Boys fully embraces the moral ugliness and psychological corruption of that world. Gemini Man gestures toward those darker implications and then continually pulls back before things become too uncomfortable. And honestly, parts of the movie also feel reminiscent of older clone thriller science fiction like The Sixth Day or Replicant, those early 2000s action movies where cloning itself functioned as the primary hook. The difference is that those films usually leaned into their pulpy absurdity with more confidence. Gemini Man constantly tries to position itself as more prestigious than it actually is. And that's probably why Ang Lee's involvement continues feeling so unusual. Because when you hear Ang Lee directing a clone assassin science fiction thriller, you naturally expect something unexpected, something more philosophical, more emotionally devastating, more introspective. Instead, the film mostly borrows the rhythms and structure of much safer mainstream action movies. and honestly, there were multiple moments where I caught myself imagining entirely different directors tackling this exact premise instead. This strange thought kept repeating in my head while watching Gemini Man. Tony Scott would have gone completely wild with this concept. Seriously, imagine peak Tony Scott directing a movie where Will Smith confronts a younger clone of himself. The paranoia, the emotional volatility, the aggressive visual energy, the overwhelming momentum, it probably would have been chaotic too, but at least it would have felt fully alive. Even someone like Paul Verhoeven could have transformed this premise into something darker and more satirical. Lean heavily into the ethics of cloning, military exploitation, aging masculinity, engineered identity, all the uncomfortable implications buried inside the idea. Instead, Gemini Man mostly settles into familiar blockbuster rhythms, and that's what continually holds it back. Every time the film hints at developing a more unique identity, another recognizable influence quietly takes over again. Another standard shootout, another exposition-heavy conversation, another rogue government operation development audiences have already seen handled more effectively in countless other thrillers, and inspiration itself isn't the problem. Every genre film borrows from something, but the strongest genre movies usually reshape their influences into something that feels distinctly personal and recognizable as their own. Gemini Man never fully gets there. It constantly feels like fragments of other movies stitched together around one genuinely compelling central gimmick. And honestly, that gimmick really was strong enough to support something special: the clone concept. The aging versus youth dynamic, the existential identity crisis underneath the action. All of that had real potential to separate the movie from the rest of the genre. But because the film repeatedly drifts back into familiar territory, you spend half the runtime thinking about movies you liked more instead of fully immersing yourself in the one currently in front of you. And honestly, that's probably one of the harsher criticisms you can make about a blockbuster. Not necessarily that it's terrible, just that it continually reminds you of stronger versions of itself. One thing I genuinely wasn't expecting from Gemini Man was how strangely sluggish parts of it feel. Not because it's attempting to be some meditative slow-burn character study disguised as an action film. It's more that the movie never completely figures out its rhythm. It keeps stopping and restarting itself. The opening is a perfect example. Technically, the movie begins with action. Henry eliminates a target from an absurd distance, and the entire trained sniper setup is clearly designed to establish how legendary and precise he is. On paper, that should immediately pull audiences into the story. But strangely, it doesn't fully land that way. And I think part of the reason is because the movie introduces us to highly skilled assassin performing impressive assassin tasks before we actually understand who Henry is emotionally. So the sequence ends up functioning more like a technical demonstration than a dramatic hook. You're watching expertise, not emotional stakes. Then the movie slows down almost immediately afterward. Retirement conversations, government suspicion, surveillance discussions, more exposition. And now those same institutions are replacing him with a cleaner, more efficient version. That's dark, especially because Junior doesn't initially understand what he really is. He believes he's special, unique, superior. But gradually he realizes his entire identity was manufactured by people who designed him for one purpose only: becoming a more controllable version of Henry. That's where the movie almost becomes genuinely tragic, because Junior is never truly allowed to become human. He's treated like a product, a prototype, a solution. The film continually circles around this idea that emotions, fear, empathy, pain, all the messy human elements that make people complicated, are weaknesses that should be engineered out entirely. And honestly, that mentality feels disturbingly believable within the world of the film. Clay genuinely believes he's improving humanity. That's what makes him conceptually more interesting than the screenplay ever fully allows him to become. He sees Henry's emotional scars as design flaws, so he creates Junior as a version supposedly free of those flaws, more efficient, more loyal, less emotionally complicated, essentially less human. That's the real horror buried underneath the premise. And honestly, some of the strongest scenes in Gemini Man happen when Henry begins understanding that Junior is less an enemy and more a victim. You can see the pity in the way he speaks to him at times. Like Henry already understands exactly where Junior's life is heading because he already lived through that same existence himself. That dynamic could have been devastating emotionally if the film had committed to it more fully, because Junior represents more than youth. He represents stolen potential, a life decided before it ever had the opportunity to become its own. He never got the freedom to naturally discover who he was supposed to be. His future was determined for him before he even existed. And there's also this fascinating meta layer to the entire concept, specifically because Will Smith is playing both roles. You're watching an older movie star literally stare at a digitally reconstructed younger version of himself, the version audiences probably remember most nostalgically. Younger Will Smith is physically flawless here, faster, sharper, more commercially appealing in that very specific Hollywood sense. Meanwhile, older Henry carries experience, pain, emotional history, and the world of the movie treats those qualities like liabilities instead of value. That's why the premise works so well conceptually. It taps directly into anxieties people already understand instinctively: aging, replacement, obsolescence. Watching younger versions take over while systems built around efficiency slowly stop valuing your experience. The science fiction framework simply transforms those fears into something literal. And honestly, the movie occasionally stumbles into surprisingly thoughtful territory because of that. Especially during the quieter scenes, where Henry and Junior actually speak to each other instead of trying to eliminate one another. Those moments hint at a smarter, sadder film hidden beneath the blockbuster surface. You start imagining what Junior's future becomes if nobody intervenes. Another isolated assassin, another disposable weapon, another man eventually discarded the moment somebody younger and more advanced gets engineered after him. An endless cycle of replacement. That's bleak. But again, the movie never fully allows itself to descend into that darkness. Every time the themes start becoming genuinely uncomfortable or emotionally interesting, the story pivots back toward familiar action thriller mechanics, which becomes frustrating because the emotional material is very clearly there. The concept of manufactured humanity alone could have sustained an entire science fiction drama. What happens when someone realizes they weren't born naturally, weren't raised freely, weren't even viewed as fully human by the people responsible for creating them? That's existential horror territory if you explore it honestly. But Gemini Man mostly uses those ideas as thematic background texture instead of making them the emotional focus of the film. Still, even during weaker scenes, you can feel those themes lingering underneath everything. The sadness of a man confronting the life he lost, the tragedy of a younger version who never had a choice, the fear of becoming obsolete inside a world obsessed with perfection and efficiency. That emotional undercurrent gives the movie more weight than the screenplay probably deserves, which honestly makes the missed potential hurt even more. Because buried underneath all the generic blockbuster machinery, there really is a genuinely human story here about aging, identity, and the terrifying possibility that systems eventually stop valuing the real you once they can manufacture something newer. At the end of the day, Gemini Man is one of those movies that's honestly harder to hate than it is to truly remember. And I know that sounds strange, but that was genuinely my biggest takeaway after it ended. Because this isn't some catastrophic disaster, it's not aggressively incompetent. There are talented actors throughout the film, some genuinely effective action sequences, a legitimately strong science fiction premise, a handful of emotional moments that almost land, and technically speaking, the movie is undeniably ambitious. You can feel that ambition in almost every frame, whether the experiment succeeds or not. But the problem is that nearly everything in the film stops at almost emotionally powerful, almost visually groundbreaking, almost thrilling, almost memorable. And after a while, that becomes frustrating in a very specific way, because you can constantly see the stronger movie trapped underneath the version we actually received. That's what makes Gemini Man feel so hollow by the end. Not because there's nothing there. Honestly, there's almost too much there. Too many themes, too many directions, too many half-developed ideas competing against one another while the movie continually becomes distracted by its own technology. And eventually, the emotional side of the film gets buried underneath all the machinery, which is strangely ironic considering the movie is fundamentally about humanity, aging, identity, fear of replacement. Manufactured people struggling to understand themselves. Those are powerful themes, the kind of ideas that could have elevated the film into something genuinely haunting. Instead, the movie mostly leaves audiences thinking about the CGI. And honestly, that's probably the biggest problem right there. When a film built around emotional conflict becomes more memorable for digital face technology than for the actual human drama underneath it, something clearly went wrong somewhere during the process. And honestly, I don't even think the movie necessarily needed to become deeper in some overtly intellectual way. It just needed to commit more confidently to something, be a thoughtful science fiction drama, be a loud blockbuster action film, be strange, be emotional, be ugly, be fun, just fully become one version of itself instead of hovering awkwardly between all of them, because the movie constantly feels hesitant. Even the ending carries that same energy. It resolves itself in this strangely clean, emotionally safe way after spending most of the runtime hinting at much darker and more complicated ideas underneath the surface. You can almost feel the studio blockbuster instincts taking control during the final stretch. Keep it accessible, keep it moving, don't push audiences too far emotionally. And honestly, that decision ends up defining the entire movie. Gemini Man continually pulls back right before it becomes truly interesting. Still, though, I can't honestly sit here and pretend I had a miserable time watching Gemini Man. I didn't. There are enough genuinely entertaining moments scattered throughout the film to keep it consistently watchable. The motorcycle pursuit is legitimately exciting. Some of the scenes between Henry and Junior genuinely carry emotional weight. Will Smith remains naturally charismatic even when the material around him struggles, and a few of the visual ideas are undeniably impressive despite the uneven CGI execution. There are absolutely worse action movies out there, but there are also far more memorable ones. And honestly, that's where the disappointment really comes from, because this film had all the ingredients necessary to become one of those intelligent, highly rewatchable science fiction thrillers people rediscover years later and suddenly appreciate more deeply. The kind of movie audiences revisit and say, you know what, that was actually ahead of its time. Instead, Gemini Man mostly feels like a massive experiment that never fully transformed into a complete film. A very expensive experiment, a technically fascinating one, but still an experiment first. And honestly, maybe that's ultimately how Gemini Man will be remembered more than anything else, not as a great action film. Not as a terrible one either, not even primarily as a Will Smith vehicle, but as this strange transitional Hollywood artifact, a movie caught somewhere between the era of traditional movie star blockbusters and the digital future studios were aggressively trying to move toward. One foot planted inside old-school action thriller storytelling, the other buried deep inside CGI experimentation, digital actors, and high frame rate filmmaking. And strangely enough, that actually makes the movie more interesting to discuss than it is to watch, because once the credits finish rolling, the thing that lingers isn't really the plot. It isn't the antagonist. It isn't even the action itself. What lingers is this persistent feeling of unrealized potential, the sensation of watching talented performers, ambitious technology, and genuinely compelling ideas orbit around something great without ever fully connecting into it. And honestly, that might be the most frustrating type of movie there is, not the films that fail completely, the ones that repeatedly show you flashes of how extraordinary they could have been.